there is a question, there are a couple of questions that are coming up sort of still related to this, so we'll stay with it. There's a mention that Millerat's study of 360 patients showed no correlation between tonsillar descent and severity of symptoms, which we kind of talked about. But
no, so I kind of disagree with that a little bit. There is definitely a correlation between tonsil position and symptoms. It's just not a clean correlation. Like you can't, there is no cut point where you can say, well, nobody ever has symptoms without this much herniation, or you can't ever say, well, everybody has symptoms with this much herniation. There are no clean cut points. Having said that, that doesn't mean there's no correlation. There is a correlation. Somebody with 25 millimeters tonsil position below the foramen magnum is absolutely more likely to have symptoms than somebody who's at 15. And that person is in turn absolutely more likely to have symptoms than somebody who's at 5. So that's a good correlation. It's just not a correlation with perfect cut points. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is not controversial. I mean, I think most people agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, you're arguing kind of the core of what epidemiology kind of doesn't always get right, is correlation versus causality. And I mean,
yeah, I mean, right. And obviously it's because it's not like the tonsils being low is what's creating the pathophysiological problem that is symptomatic Chiari. I mean, obviously it's not the lowness of the tonsils, it's the crowding. And I think we all kind of get that, but we just can't measure that very well. So we're using a secondary measure that's easy to measure.
Well, to that.
But people with very low tonsils are much more likely to have crowded posterior fossas that are symptomatic.
Right. But to that point, there was recent studies out of Wisconsin and Children's National. This is a question that came up, that PCMR axial flow, and these are studies of about 100 patients. They all exhibited abnormalities, and the types and degree of that abnormality seem to correlate with those severity of symptoms. Is that maybe something that is like clinically useful, or?
It hasn't been, at least for us. You know, obviously it is a nice research technique, and everybody is, for probably going on 30 years now, everybody has been working with MR flow studies to try to understand how we can use them clinically. And when they first came out, everyone was really excited about it, and everyone thought, oh, we've solved the problem because now we can just send people for this flow study, and people with impaired flow should get surgery. Well, again, that's very problematic, because lots of healthy, well-appearing, well-feeling people have impaired flow when we get flow studies on MRI. There is definitely a correlation, a little bit like what we were talking about with the tonsils. Everybody agrees there's a correlation, and the more impaired your flow is, the more likely you are to have symptoms. The problem is, the lower your tonsils are, that's true as well. And then also we can just kind of look at you and talk to you and kind of get a sense for what your symptoms are. So with us, and we studied this at our place, and others I think have done very similar work, there is no question that flow measurements correlate with symptoms, but it's not perfect. And the real question that's important clinically is not, is there a correlation? The question is there a clinically useful correlation that will add something to our decision making? And at least for us, what we found is, if we know what the patient's symptom status is, and if we've looked at the MRI scan and we know what the morphology is, like how low are the tonsils, are they pointed, and so on, then having the CSF flow data actually never really changes our opinion about whether to operate on that person. In no case that I can remember in a couple of decades has that changed my mind. You already kind of know what the recommendation should be based on the patient's symptomatic status and what the MRI is. So 20 years ago, we got flow studies on everybody. In the last 5 years or so, I don't really care what the flow studies are anymore, and I mostly don't order them. The radiologists will frequently add them to our MRIs for Chiari anyway, because they're interested in it, but I don't order them routinely anymore. I don't find that they're helpful. I was on a panel a little bit like this one a few years ago with a number of people from CSF. And I thought it was really interesting. There were 5 or 6 people on the panel, and this question came up. And the question was, you know, nobody mentioned CSF flow in all of this talk about Chiari, how come that is, and do you still get CSF flow? And not a single person on the panel did, which again, that was my feeling. I didn't realize that was what everybody else had moved to as well. So I think that's on the wane right now. Perhaps that will change if we can get better information about it, but that's been the case so far.